The Alaskan wilderness is a place of beauty and of disappearance. A land so vast, so merciless, that when someone vanishes, they are often swallowed whole, never to be seen again. But what if the wilderness wasn't to blame? What if something, or someone, was waiting, watching and choosing its next prey? Before we begin, if you have a taste for the darkest, most chilling true crime stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss a single tale that keeps you looking over your shoulder at night. Between the late 1970s and early 1980s, young women in the remote town of Kodiak Falls began to disappear without a trace. These weren't just isolated incidents. One missing person case turned into 2, then 3, then more, each one vanishing under eerily similar circumstances. The missing women came from different backgrounds. Some were local, others were just passing through, but they all had one thing in common: they were last seen alive within the town's quiet streets. Some were waitresses trying to save up for a better life, others were dancers looking for a fresh start, and a few were simply travelers who made the mistake of stopping in the wrong place at the wrong time. One by one, they faded from existence, their names and faces reduced to grainy newspaper headlines, their fates unknown. No calls to family, no signs of struggle, and no bodies, just an eerie silence that lingered over the town like an unspoken curse. It wasn't until later that investigators began to piece together the disturbing truth, a truth that pointed to one unlikely place, a small bakery, tucked away on Main Street, run by a man who seemed incapable of harm. A man the town trusted. A man no one suspected. Kodiak Falls was the kind of place where people prided themselves on knowing their neighbors, where doors were rarely locked, and where winters were long and punishing, but the sense of community was stronger than the cold. It was the last place anyone would expect such a nightmare to unfold, yet the very remoteness that made it feel safe also made it the perfect hunting ground. Dense forests stretched for miles beyond the town, and in every direction, nature reigned supreme. The wilderness was vast, unforgiving, and mercilessly silent, a place where the wind howled through the trees like distant screams and the ground could swallow secrets whole. Out here, a person could vanish without a trace, and no one would ever find them. This was the world Daniel Brooks lived in, and he knew exactly how to use it to his advantage. To the people of Kodiak Falls, Daniel Brooks was nothing more than a quiet, unassuming man who had built a respectable life for himself. He owned a local bakery, known for its warm bread, fresh pastries, and inviting atmosphere, and he had a reputation for being kind-hearted, always willing to lend a hand to those in need. He was polite, soft-spoken, and never the kind of person to draw attention to himself. Customers would often see him standing behind the counter, greeting them with a friendly nod, his apron dusted with flour, his hands kneading dough as if his world revolved around nothing more than the simple act of baking. But that was just the image he carefully crafted, the mask he wore every single day. Because beneath that mild-mannered facade lurked something far more terrifying, something hidden just below the surface. What the townspeople didn't know was that Daniel Brooks was not just a baker, he was a predator. A man whose passion for hunting extended far beyond animals. A man whose appetite for control, for domination, for the thrill of the chase, could never be satisfied by ordinary means. And the most chilling part? He had been perfecting his method for years, right under their noses. He was meticulous. Precise. He had a pattern, one that, for a long time, no one could see. He didn't choose his victims at random. He was patient, watching, waiting for the right moment. He sought out women who were vulnerable, those who were struggling, those who were disconnected from their families or living on the fringes of society. He knew exactly how to approach them, exactly what to say to make them trust him. He was never forceful, never aggressive. Instead, he played the role of the kind stranger, the man with a generous offer, the one who could provide a warm meal, a little extra money, or even a way out of town for those desperate enough to take it. And they did. Time and time again, they followed him, stepping into his car, believing they had found a small moment of kindness in a harsh world. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't have known, was that this ride would be their last. Because once they left the safety of town, once the buildings faded away into the endless trees and the roads stretched into nothingness, there was no turning back. The moment the doors locked, the hunt had already begun. The small town of Kodiak Falls may have been where Daniel Brooks lured his victims, but it was not where their nightmares truly began. His real hunting ground lay beyond the edges of civilization, deep within the vast, untamed Alaskan wilderness, a place so remote, so unforgiving, that even the most desperate cries for help would be swallowed by the wind. This land, stretching for miles in every direction, was not just a setting for his crimes. It was his domain, his playground, his personal stage where he could indulge in the most twisted game imaginable. Out here, there were no witnesses. No neighbors to overhear. No chance of escape. Once he drove his victims past the last signs of human life, there was no coming back. Daniel had a method, one that he refined with each new disappearance. After gaining his victims' trust in town, he would offer them a ride, promising them work, shelter, or simply a safe place to stay. But once they were in his truck, the journey took a terrifying turn. The roads grew narrower, the trees pressed in closer, and the realization would begin to sink in: they were heading somewhere isolated, somewhere they weren't meant to be. The destination was always the same, an old, weathered cabin, miles from the nearest town, hidden so deep in the forest that even the most experienced trackers would struggle to find it. It was here, in this place of absolute isolation, that their ordeal truly began. Inside the cabin, Daniel controlled everything. He restrained his victims, binding their wrists and ankles, ensuring that escape was impossible. But he wasn't just interested in control, he wanted to break them. To toy with them. To push them past the limits of fear. He would keep them for hours, sometimes days, forcing them to endure a cruel game of psychological torment. He would whisper false promises of release, only to snatch away hope at the last moment. He would pretend to let them go, only to remind them that he alone decided their fate. And when he finally grew tired of his twisted games, when the terror in their eyes no longer satisfied him, he would offer them one final chance, a head start. A moment to run. A false sense of freedom before the real hunt began. Hunting had always been Daniel's passion. He was an expert marksman, someone who had spent years tracking and killing wild animals in the harsh Alaskan terrain. But at some point, animals were no longer enough. He craved something more challenging, something that could think, and something that could beg. And so, he turned his skills toward the most dangerous game, human beings. He would untie his victims, force them outside, and tell them they had a chance. If they could escape, they would live. If they could make it through the endless trees, dodge his rifle, outsmart him in the wilderness he knew so well, they could be free. But there was no real escape. No real hope. Because he wasn't just a hunter. He was the one who controlled the entire game. The forest, once a place of beauty and solitude, became a nightmarish labyrinth for those unfortunate enough to be trapped in his deadly sport. The ground, thick with fallen leaves and tangled roots, made every step treacherous. The bitter cold gnawed at their exposed skin, slowing them down, making them weak. The darkness pressed in, making it impossible to tell which direction was safe. And somewhere, hidden in the trees, Daniel Brooks watched. He moved silently, his rifle steady, his breath calm. He let them run just far enough to believe they had a chance before he fired the first shot. Not to kill. Not yet. Just close enough to make their hearts race, to remind them that he was there, that he was coming for them. And then, the chase would begin in earnest. There's an old saying among hunters: the most dangerous game to hunt is man. And Daniel Brooks took that idea and turned it into his reality. He had perfected the art of stalking, of waiting, of letting fear do most of the work for him. He didn't have to rush. He didn't have to chase them down immediately. He let them run until exhaustion set in, until panic clouded their judgment, until they made a mistake. And when they did, when they tripped, when they hesitated, when they thought, for even a second, that they might have a chance, he would strike. A single shot, echoing through the empty wilderness. A sound that no one would ever hear. And just like that, another life was erased, another name forgotten, another secret buried beneath the endless trees. For years, authorities overlooked the growing number of missing women. Many of them lived on the margins of society, dancers, hitchhikers, runaways, and those with no close family to report them missing. They were transient, moving from one town to the next, and it was easy for law enforcement to assume they had simply left on their own accord. It was the late 1970s, and in a rugged, isolated place like Kodiak Falls, people disappeared all the time. Some were swallowed by the vast wilderness, lost to the icy rivers, dense forests, or the unforgiving cold. Others left town without saying a word, searching for a new start elsewhere. But as the disappearances continued, a quiet unease settled over the community. Some of these women had left their belongings behind, wallets, IDs, even uncashed paychecks. Something didn't add up. Still, without any concrete evidence, police had little to go on. That was until one woman did the impossible. She survived. Lisa Monroe had been reported missing just days earlier. By all accounts, she had vanished without a trace, just like the others. But then, on a cold, foggy morning, she stumbled into a police station, barefoot, bleeding, her clothes in tatters. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, struggling to speak. When she finally found the words, her voice was barely more than a whisper. What she described was something no one wanted to believe. A man had taken her. A man everyone in town knew. A man no one had ever suspected. He had chained her in a dark room, taunted her, and told her there was no way out. But by sheer luck, or perhaps sheer will, she had managed to break free. She ran for hours, through thick forests and icy streams, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and the nightmare she had just escaped. At first, detectives were skeptical. It seemed too outlandish, too monstrous to be real. The man she was accusing? A well-respected business owner. A friendly, soft-spoken baker. The idea that he could be responsible for something so horrific seemed absurd. But there was something in Lisa's eyes, something raw, something unmistakable. Fear. The kind of fear that couldn't be faked. So they listened. And then, they investigated. The moment they stepped onto his remote property, a chill ran through them. The air was still. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. But beneath the peaceful exterior, something dark lingered. It didn't take long before they found the first sign that Lisa had been telling the truth. In the basement of his cabin, hidden behind a false wall, they discovered a room that made their blood run cold. Chains hung from the ceiling. Heavy restraints were bolted to the floor. The walls were lined with tools, some of them rusted, others suspiciously clean. A single chair sat in the center of the room, its armrests worn, as if someone had gripped them too tightly, too many times. Then came the worst discovery of all. Scattered throughout the room were personal belongings. A necklace. A woman's driver's license. A small gold ring. A single high-heeled shoe. None of them belonged to Lisa. None of them belonged to his wife. And that could only mean one thing: Lisa was not his first victim. As investigators searched deeper, they uncovered something even more disturbing. Tucked away in a drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old receipts, were hand-drawn maps. Dozens of them. They showed the surrounding wilderness, detailed with an unsettling level of precision. But what stood out most were the X's, carefully placed, deliberately marked spots scattered throughout the dense forests. Detectives knew what they had to do. Following the maps, they ventured deep into the Alaskan wilderness. The air was thick with silence as they arrived at the first marked location. They started digging. Within minutes, they hit something solid. A bone. Then another. And another. One by one, the locations on the maps revealed their secrets. Shallow graves. Buried remains. Torn clothing. Rusted bullet casings. They weren't just looking for missing women anymore. They were uncovering a mass graveyard, a twisted collection of human trophies, a record of the horrors that had remained hidden for years. That was when they realized, they were not dealing with an ordinary predator. This was something far worse. The arrest of Daniel Brooks sent an icy chill through the town of Kodiak Falls, shattering the quiet illusion of safety that had existed for decades. One moment, he was a respected business owner, a friendly face behind the counter of the local bakery, a man whose warm smile and firm handshake made him seem like the last person capable of committing unspeakable acts. The next, he was being led away in handcuffs, his expression disturbingly blank, his eyes revealing nothing as flashing red and blue lights illuminated the early morning streets. As news of his arrest spread, neighbors whispered in hushed voices, customers who had once frequented his shop stared in disbelief, and those who had trusted him felt a sickening sense of betrayal settle in their stomachs. How could they have been so blind? How could a man so seemingly ordinary hide such monstrous secrets? But taking him into custody was only the beginning. The real challenge would be proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was the predator authorities believed him to be. Inside the interrogation room, Brooks remained eerily calm. He sat with his hands folded neatly on the table, his posture relaxed, his voice steady as he denied everything. "I don't know what she told you," he said, referring to Lisa Monroe, the woman whose daring escape had unraveled his carefully constructed facade. "But she's lying. These women, they were drifters. They came and went. I didn't do anything to them." His words were measured, his demeanor unervingly composed, as though he truly believed he could talk his way out of it. He claimed that every single one of the missing women had left town of their own accord, that he had never harmed anyone, that the entire investigation was nothing more than a desperate attempt to pin unrelated disappearances on the easiest target. But his lies were no match for the mountain of evidence piling up against him. Lisa Monroe was the first to take the stand, her voice unwavering despite the horror she had endured. The courtroom was silent as she described, in excruciating detail, the nightmare she had survived, the cold steel of the chains that had bound her wrists, the suffocating darkness of his basement, the way he had watched her, studying her reactions as though she were nothing more than another one of his prey. She spoke of the moment he had driven her deep into the wilderness, the sheer terror of realizing she was being hunted like an animal, the desperate sprint for her life through the trees, barefoot and bleeding, every rustling branch sending waves of panic through her body. She painted a picture so vivid, so terrifying, that jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away as though trying to escape the images her words conjured in their minds. But testimony alone wouldn't be enough to convict him. The prosecution needed something undeniable. Something that would tie Brooks directly to the missing women. That something came in the form of forensic evidence. Investigators had scoured every inch of his remote property, sifting through soil, peeling back layers of secrecy that had hidden his crimes for far too long. In his basement, they discovered blood, faint, almost invisible to the naked eye, but damning under forensic testing. It belonged to a woman who had vanished years earlier, a woman Brooks swore he had never met. Then there were the trophies, items that seemed insignificant on their own, but together painted a horrifying picture. Jewelry, ID cards, personal belongings that had no reason to be in his possession, all traced back to women who had disappeared without a trace. And then came the maps. Brooks had always been known as an expert hunter, someone who prided himself on his knowledge of the Alaskan wilderness. His cabin was filled with detailed topographical maps, each marked with small red X's. At first, detectives assumed they were locations for hunting game, until they started matching them to reports of human remains found over the years. The chilling realization settled in, these weren't hunting spots for animals. These were burial sites. The prosecution presented the evidence one by one, piece by piece, building an airtight case against him. The jurors listened as forensic experts explained how the blood stains in Brooks' basement matched missing women, how fibers from his truck lined up with clothing recovered from shallow graves, how the items found in his possession linked him to victims he swore he had never seen before. But perhaps the most damning evidence came not from science, but from the land itself. Hunters had stumbled upon remains deep in the wilderness, skeletonized bodies, their bones marked by the passage of time, some with bullet fragments still embedded in them. These were the same locations marked on Brooks' maps, the same places he had frequented for years under the guise of an innocent outdoorsman. The moment these connections were revealed, the air in the courtroom seemed to change, as if everyone present had finally grasped the full scale of what he had done. When the jury finally reached their verdict, there was no hesitation. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. The judge's voice was steady, unwavering, as he read the decision that would seal Brooks' fate. Guilty. Brooks remained still, his expression unreadable, as if he had already resigned himself to the inevitable. There was no outburst, no plea for mercy, no last attempt to shift the blame. He simply stood there, silent, as the judge handed down his sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the only punishment that fit the gravity of his crimes, the only way to ensure that he would never again have the chance to prey on another victim. But even as the trial concluded, as Brooks was led away in shackles, one haunting truth remained: authorities were certain that they had not uncovered all of his victims. The vastness of the Alaskan wilderness meant that for every grave they had found, there were likely more, hidden beneath the snow and soil, lost in the unforgiving landscape. Some believed the full extent of his crimes would never be known. Others feared that somewhere, in the deep, uncharted woods, the secrets of Daniel Brooks would remain buried forever, waiting to be uncovered by those unlucky enough to stumble upon them. There are stories, whispers carried by the wind through the dense Alaskan wilderness, about those who venture too far into the unforgiving landscape, only to find something they were never meant to see. A rusted rifle leaning against a tree, its barrel weathered by time. A lone boot half buried in the frozen earth, its owner nowhere to be found. A shallow grave, unmarked and forgotten, holding secrets that the wilderness refuses to give up. Hikers speak of an eerie silence that falls over certain parts of the forest, as if nature itself knows what once transpired there. Some claim to have seen old hunting cabins, long abandoned yet strangely intact, with furniture left in place, as if the occupant had simply vanished into the trees. And then there are those who swear they've heard something even more unsettling, a twig snapping just beyond the reach of their flashlight, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow when no one else should be there. The weight of something unseen pressing against them, a force that tells them to turn back before they go too far. The case of Daniel Brooks ended with a conviction, a sentence that ensured he would never again walk free. His crimes were laid bare for the world to see, his reign of terror over, and his hunting grounds abandoned to the elements. But the wilderness does not give up its dead so easily. Investigators believe there are more bodies, more graves waiting to be found, victims whose stories may never be told. The vastness of Alaska swallows evidence whole, concealing the truth beneath thick forests, icy rivers, and endless miles of untouched land. How many more red X's marked his maps? How many more women met their end beneath the same cold stars, their screams swallowed by the wind? How many families still wonder what happened to their daughters, their sisters, their mothers, never knowing that the answers lie buried beneath layers of frost and time? Search teams have ventured into those woods, hoping to recover what remains, hoping to bring closure to the families left behind. But nature has a way of reclaiming its own. Bones sink into the earth, scattered by scavengers, hidden beneath decades of snowfall. A piece of fabric, a rusted bracelet, a lock of hair tangled in the roots of an ancient tree, small fragments of lives erased. And yet, despite the horror uncovered, despite the overwhelming evidence of Brooks' depravity, one question remains unanswered. Did he truly act alone? For years, locals have whispered about a second figure, a shadow lingering just outside the frame of Brooks' crimes. A partner, an accomplice, someone who knew the land just as well as he did, someone who could still be out there. There were rumors of another hunter, someone who shared Brooks' obsession, someone who learned from him or, worse, helped him carry out his twisted fantasies. Some believe the second man was real, that he watched from the tree line as Brooks was arrested, waiting for the dust to settle before reclaiming the hunting ground as his own. Others insist that Brooks himself spoke of a brother in the woods, a friend, a confidant, a ghost who left no trace. Could another predator still stalk the Alaskan wilderness, waiting for the right moment to strike? Did Brooks take his secrets to the grave, or did he leave behind a legacy far more terrifying than anyone realized? Perhaps the most chilling thought of all is this: somewhere, deep in the frozen wilderness, the hunt may not be over. Perhaps, even now, someone is watching, waiting. A hunter standing at the edge of the tree line, scanning the vast expanse before him, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to step into his territory. And if you ever find yourself alone on a desolate trail, miles from civilization, and you hear footsteps behind you, ask yourself, are you really alone? Or has the predator found its next prey? If you're fascinated by true crime and the darkest corners of human nature, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to turn on that notification bell, because you won't want to miss what's coming next.